I'm Gregory Feifer. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs, which has been sending fellows to Russia since the 1920s. And I'm also a journalist who writes about Russia. And another very warm welcome to our discussion about history and Putin's Russia. And thanks also to the Pulitzer Center for co-sponsoring this event with us. Now, it is just 5 days away from the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution next Tuesday, November 7th. Actually, the 25th of October, according to the Julian calendar that the Russians used to use. But the Kremlin has been at pains to play down the anniversary of the Russian Revolution this month. Not only, I think, as a reminder to Russians of the power of the people, but also because that event highlights the contradictions in Putin's fashioning of a new national identity that draws on a schizophrenic pastiche of historical symbols lifted from all context. Perhaps that's par for the course in a country where paradox is one of the few constants, and where, as they say, the future is certain, it's the past that's unpredictable. Joining me to discuss the continuity in Russian politics and society is a stellar panel of Russia observers. Marvin Kalb, at the far end, is a legend of journalism. A non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and a senior advisor at the Pulitzer Center, his storied career has included award-winning reporting for CBS, including as Moscow correspondent, and NBC News as chief diplomatic correspondent and anchor of Meet the Press. He went on to found Harvard University's Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. And his 15th book, as Jeff said, is just out. 15th book, The Year That I Was Peter the Great, about his time as a Harvard doctoral student and a young diplomatic attaché at the US Embassy in Moscow in 1956, when Khrushchev nicknamed him Peter the Great. Speaking of Khrushchev, Nina Khrushcheva, in the middle, is Professor of International Affairs and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the New School, and a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute in New York. She has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications. She's also the author of Imagining Nabokov, Russia Between Art and Politics, and The Lost Khrushchev, a journey into the gulag of the Russian mind, in which she describes her family history and the story of her grandfather, Leonid Khrushchev, eldest son of the former Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. And Andrew Weiss is Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees research in Washington and Moscow about Russia and Eurasia. Before that, he was Director of the RAND Corporation's Center for Russia and Eurasia and Executive Director of the RAND Business Leaders Forum. He served as Director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian Affairs on the National Security Council staff and is a member of the State Department's Policy Planning staff, among other positions. And I have to add that one of his many accomplishments was to have emerged from an interview in a segment of Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, not only with his reputation fully intact, but looking very authoritative, which is very rare indeed. So we'll have a discussion for about 45 minutes to an hour, as Jeff said, and then we'll open the floor to questions. And I'd like to start by going directly back to Russian history and asking Marvin to talk about his experiences in 1956. The few Americans whom I've spoken to who managed to get to Moscow in the 1950s talk about how much the city felt like a great big village rather than the grand socialist metropolis that was envisioned. And I have to say that despite the huge construction projects and the fancy restaurants and office blocks going up, it still has the feel of a sprawling village to me. So how did it feel to you first arriving there in 1956?
For me, to arrive in Russia in January of 1956, when it was 42 below zero on that day, was a chilling experience. And I was incredibly excited. I had spent so much of my life up to that point, and most of it since that time, trying to understand this country, trying to understand its people, trying to understand what it's going to do next, or even understand what it's doing right now. And for me, as a student trying to get a PhD, looking to do research on a man named Sergei Semyonovich Uvarov, who was the Minister of Education under Nicholas I. And the first thing I ran into when I would go to the Lenin Library is people would ask, why in God's name are you studying Uvarov when you could study Lenin? Because Lenin represents the future, Uvarov was the past. And thus began an adventure for me which took me from one end of the Soviet Union to the other, because I was at that time very young, and though an attaché at the US Embassy, I really represented nothing that looked like power. I was a kid who sharpened pencils. And so I was able to wander around, and in '56, Russia began to open up just a little bit, and that introduced what was called the thaw. And the reason for the thaw was that Nikita Khrushchev delivered a stunningly important speech before the 20th Party Congress. It was February 25th of 1956, in which he launched into a 4-hour attack on Stalin. And that was astonishing to all of the people who listened, because most of those people had their careers because of Stalin. They were creatures of Stalin. And here was the number one man, the top of the Communist Party, saying that Stalin, far from being a genius, was a criminal, a murderer, somebody who almost lost the entire Soviet Union to Nazi Germany in 1941 because he wouldn't listen to anybody. And that, the effect of that, I cannot stress enough, was stunning. From what I'm told, I obviously was not there. No foreigner was allowed in. People were popping nitroglycerin tablets. A number of people literally had heart attacks. Some people committed suicide later. We'll never know exact numbers. But it was the kind of speech that they knew was uprooting society. It was giving the Russian people, for the first time in their lives, a whiff of personal freedom. Because if you remove from them the fear of being awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning and being hauled off to Siberia, you remove that, suddenly you have a feeling that you may be in control of your life. I don't want to overstate that in any way, but that was new. And it was, for many people, intoxicating, especially for young people. I spent a lot of time with young Soviet students, and I heard them stand up right there in the Lenin Library and denounce communism, denounce Stalin, but that was already acceptable in a way, but they were also denouncing Khrushchev. They were denouncing the system, and they wanted something new. And that whole idea of the thaw spread throughout the Soviet Union and then went off into Eastern Europe, into the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. And it hit first in Poznan in June of 1956, then went to Czechoslovakia, and in October hit Hungary in a very big way. And the Hungarians took Khrushchev at his word. They wanted individual freedom, but they also wanted national independence. And that would have meant, since a number of them already said we wanted to be like Yugoslavia, if you pulled out of the system, following the example of Yugoslavia, and if Hungary went first, Poland would have gone very quickly thereafter. And then what would have happened? Would Khrushchev have tried to keep the empire together or let it go? And he was under enormous pressure in the Politburo. Molotov, the foreign minister, was leading that attack. And Khrushchev decided he had no alternative but to crush the Hungarian Revolution, which he did brutally. And many people were killed. And I was astonished in December of that year to be at a National Day reception. Khrushchev was going to many of these. And to hear Khrushchev say, for the first time since he attacked Stalin in February, in December, he said, when the history of Marxism-Leninism is written, the great contribution of of Stalin. And he spoke about Stalin and mentioned his name twice in a brief toast. That was astonishing, and everybody understood that the experiment of the thaw was essentially over. And I will conclude my comment here by simply telling you a quick story about the Peter the Great anecdote, because it is the title of the book. As I said, Khrushchev was attending National Day receptions, and he came to the July 4th reception at the ambassador's home, Ambassador Bolin, at Spaso House. And Ambassador Bolin then had 3 others at the embassy who spoke Russian. And I was one of them. And he assigned me to look after Marshal Zhukov, the Minister of Defense, the hero of Stalingrad, and I was a former PFC in the United States Army. So there was a certain asymmetry. But I did what I was supposed to do to make sure that Zhukov was being served vodka and I water, because I didn't drink, but I wanted to be friendly. Tang, the ambassador's butler, worked it out in such a way that Zhukov would have vodka and I would have water, and we talked for a good 45 minutes. And the marshal was getting a bit tipsy. And Khrushchev signaled that it was time to go. We walked over to him, and Zhukov said to him in a very loud voice, "Nikita Sergeyevich, I have finally found a young American who can drink like a Russian." And that was, you got a laugh from Khrushchev too. And he looked up, he was about 5'6". 5'3", well, and I was 6'3", so he looked up at me and he said, and by the way, I had been talking with Zhukov about many Russian battles, including Poltava, which was Peter the Great's great battle, one of his, and so Peter was on my mind, and he said, "How tall are you?" I said, "I'm 6 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great." He loved it, absolutely loved it. And I loved it too, because when I returned to Moscow for CBS 2 years later, Khrushchev still remembered Peter the Great, and I was able to get close to him for stories, some of them exclusive, like I could shoot a fly in the sky at 60,000 feet. That's right after Gary Powers. That was a big deal. But I got it because I was Peter the Great. So I thank you very much.
Last week, there was a big investor conference in Moscow, which is supposed to be the way of sort of razzle-dazzling Western investors and showing how attractive Russia is for a variety of reasons. The chairman of one of Russia's largest state banks showed up at that event dressed as Stalin. And his idea of kind of how to sort of lighten the mood was to have this kind of neo-Soviet theme and set of Stalinist iconography trotted out at every turn. That to me is just, it's something that kind of brings the bile up in my throat, given what you said at the beginning about how many people's lives were needlessly sacrificed after October 1917. You drive around the grounds of the Kremlin, and there is now this completely out of place, oversized statue of Tsar Vladimir, which sits at one of the entrances to the Kremlin, which is the place where sort of Putin or other leaders, when they zoom in and out in their motorcades, enter and exit the Kremlin. It's completely out of proportion and out of sync with the sort of normal architectural layout of that part of Moscow. There is now, throughout the sort of public and internet-based discourse in Russia, a set of symbols that are being revived, whether it's the secret police in the 1930s, where kids were dressing up at Moscow City Day not that long ago, wearing the uniforms of the secret police from the 1930s. These are all, heavily politically freighted and to my mind, rather unacceptable appropriations of a period in Russian history which needs more self-appraisal and more self-criticism, not a kind of sense that, as you said, mistakes were made, but it was all in furtherance of these great national goals. Fast forwarding to what is on the agenda now is Vladimir Putin is running for election. There will be an election in Russia in March 2018. And all of this stuff, this kind of image making and hagiography, are really the election platform. It's not, I'm going to do great things, I'm going to return Russia to a level of socioeconomic accomplishment, I'm going to make sure that Russia matters or that your individual well-being is improved. It's really that you are endorsing Vladimir Putin, man of history, for what many presume will be his last term. Parallel to that is an effort to kind of replenish and rejuvenate the Russian elite. And for the first time, we see a new generation of people who are being groomed to take over, whether that actually occurs or whether these are people who are going to be placeholders for the next 10 years or 6 years or however long Putin decides to be the supreme leader is unclear. But what you definitely see is a system where personal power and the personalized authority of Putin as a kind of quasi-czar figure is what's central. It's not really about what ideas he has or what vision he has for Russia. It's a very personalistic regime. And as a result, and here's where I'll wrap up, it's really hard to run a country as big as Russia with that kind of setup. And if you go back in Russian history, it's not that unusual that power is so hyper-concentrated. And the one practical illustration of this, which I'll give you, is in the medieval period, when it would take people more than a year to go from one part of Russia to Moscow. It was still a requirement to register certain real estate transactions in Moscow. So you would have people who would have to make this horrible trek across the country through, a country with no roads and great dangers on the roads, on the path to Moscow, to do really basic things. And you see illustrations of that kind of hyper-centralization today. And as a result, on one hand, everything depends on Putin, and on the other hand, there's just too much going on that can't really compete for that person's attention. So you see any number of activities being carried out at lower levels, where people either claim they're acting in Putin's name or implementing some agenda that Putin is thought to endorse. But it really creates a much more unruly and disruptive model of politics than we, I think, sort of take for granted when we talk about Russia today.
Thanks, Andrew. And Nina, you're of course directly connected to Russia's political history.
Don't hold it against me.
And Andrew raised these uncomfortable moments. Marvin directly talked about them. Of course, Khrushchev is a very difficult figure, I think, for the Kremlin today because he was a reformer threatening the certainties of the traditional system. I'd like to ask you about that, but you spent last summer traveling across the country documenting the statues of another Soviet leader. Would you like to describe that?
I would, and I would like to, not to disagree with Andrew, because I do agree with everything you said, but this travel in Russia that we think is so complicated is not. I just took a month and a half, and I just went through all time zones from Kaliningrad, which used to be Königsberg, a town in Germany, East Prussia, now it's Kaliningrad, taken over by the Soviets after World War II. And I went all the way to Kamchatka, where I said hello to Sarah Palin, saw her in the backyard. It took some time, but actually what Putin did, and it is a very uneven environment, and some places have roads and some do not. As Andrew pointed out, and all of you pointed out, Russia is a big country, and also it does grandiosity. It does grandiosity like nobody else. If there is something that we do on a big scale. That's what we like emperors, not just the czars. And so it seems that one of the orders that was given by the Kremlin, especially in recent years, is that whatever it is your little governors or little mayors do in your little places, you do. But you make sure that the roads are functioning, that people do not come to me, that your железные дороги, the railway system, and by the way, the railway system is actually really quite remarkable. Most train stations are infinitely better than airports when you fly around in the United States. So that was the order, is that make sure that you fix general life problems. The kindergartens would be there, maybe not for everybody, but we make sure that those little people that are there, that are my subjects, are not coming to me complaining. because I'm dealing with big issues like hacking the United States elections. So these are very big issues for me. And I really think that that makes Putin, continuously make Putin the leader that most Russians, not all Russians, not 95% as we are told, but 60%, around 60% would say, if not Putin, who else? And this is really a very big idea that I've been seeing all across the across Russia. What was interesting about Khrushchev is that Russia now, into what Andrew was saying about Vladimir the Great, because Ukraine actually has the original Vladimir the Baptizer, Nicholas the First. Put him in Kiev. Vladimir baptized Kiev and Rus, and Russia and Ukraine derived from that very nation. Putin wanted Vladimir back because now we have Crimea, so we have to have Vladimir because Kiev and Rus was baptized in Crimea, so we want that. Ukrainians said no, he's ours. So Putin put his own. It's kind of the fight or the tale of two Vladimirs. But we also have Vladimir Putin, and then we also have Vladimir Lenin. So there's a whole mess of many Vladimirs all around. But it is remarkable in a sense that it's not just Vladimir the Great and that kind of a succession of leaders that Putin looks into. Vladimir the Great, then you have Peter the Great, came out in many places. We have Ivan the Terrible that came out in Nizhny Novgorod. I mean, he was not a pretty pictured Tsar, and yet he's now a great hero. There are plenty of Stalins that I've seen, by the way. There's one very important one in Yakutsk, quite good looking. Well, anyway, so there's a couple of pictures that I put here. So this is a very famous Lenin, Ulan-Ude. In Yakutia, it's the largest Lenin's head in the universe. The reason it's so bizarre, and it's not actually statue, because it was not done by an architect or a sculptor. It was actually done in the каменно-дробительный. It was the stone quarry, right? So that's how it was done, and was put in 71 for Lenin's anniversary. Still there, probably the best Lenin of all, because he's the cleanest. A lot of them are being damaged by others. So this is Lenin in Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk is a wonderful place where protests going on like there is no tomorrow. So Lenin actually is a site for many protesters speaking up their minds. So that's a good Lenin to have. Then one is, I love this Lenin. This is in Omsk in Siberia. That Lenin has a little cathedral behind him, because something that is also wonderful about Putin's Russia, it's a split personality disorder. You kind of pick hammer and sickle, red flag, Lenin, Stalin, Vladimir the Great, who baptized, so was supposed to be atheists and whatnot. And so there is a little cathedral. We now unite them, because whatever was Russia history was, anything that was great is ours. And that, I think, is also great Putin's achievement, is that he allows people to pick and choose. It's like a, what's this, smorgasbord. You take in and out. And another thing I love, good, fine, forget it. This is Yekaterinburg, a Yeltsin city. In a Yeltsin city, Lenin is being dirty and under construction, because the whole city is about Yeltsin. And by the way, Yekaterinburg is the only place, you ask about leaders, the only place where Yeltsin exists. Because Russia now has all these old leaders that you described, the Tsarist leaders, then it has Stalin, and then it has Putin, and that's it. So Yeltsin exists in Yekaterinburg. And when you go to Yeltsin Museum, which is remarkable, you kind of see that is a different kind of leader, and actually Russia was going somewhere. It is a propaganda place, mind you, but Russia was going somewhere. In no other place Yeltsin exists. And Khrushchev and Gorbachev, they fell out of history completely. There's just no such thing. You can hear in a Stalin bunker, if you go to a Stalin bunker, which is a remarkable place, a Stalin bunker in Kuybyshev, Samara, it was the capital during World War II, where Stalin was supposed to come, never did, but you can go there. It's a museum. And we're competitive people. We always want what the West has, but bigger. And so the story there is that the bunker in Russia is deeper than Churchill's bunker and Hitler's bunker. So we have the greatest bunker in the world. The greatest bunker in Europe, mind you. And then I say, well, is Kuibyshev in Europe? Is somebody in Europe? It's like, no, we're not in Europe. But our comparisons are European. And there you can hear that under Stalin, there was an order and great, wonderful things. But under Khrushchev, there was no order. That's the only time I heard Khrushchev's name. There's no such thing. So then Yakutsk, here it is, Stalin. And by the way, this is the area where a very important diamond cutting business exists. So, they love their own Stalin and diamond cutting industry. Then this is another Yakutsk Lenin, and I love the fact that he actually has this hand stretched over exactly the way we have on the poster. And this is a sad, very sad Lenin. This is on a Kolyma highway. If you all know what the Kolyma highway, it was one of the worst gulag highways that you can go to. This is on the highway. It's an apocalyptic, tiny little town that produces gold and gets nothing for it. And so this Lenin is the dirtiest one I've ever seen, and there is a church behind him, which is also very dirty. Okay, this is one of my favorites. So Petropalovsk-Kamchatsky, and can you do another? Okay, and here, so I couldn't fit them in because there's a grandiose nation, and so this is a very big square. They're on the same square. They share the same square. Once again, whatever works for us, it's the double-headed ego or Lenin together in one square. We just take it anyway. But you do have a little bit sort of blurry eye by the end of the trip because there are many Vladimirs, many statues, and many formulas of greatness. But sort of one thing that I took out of it is that Russia changes, Russia stays the same.
Could I make a brief comment?
Jump in, please, Marvin.
Okay. We've heard Andrew do an excellent summation of Putin and where he is today. And Nina has just taken us on a glorious ride through Russia and looking at monuments to Lenin and Putin, perhaps. The point that I would like to make is that while an impression could be created that this is a country that can live only under the thumb of a very strong leader, and that may be the case. One of the biggest question marks about Russia, and it has been for hundreds of years, is its sheer size. It is an enormous country. I mean, stretching from Poland to the Pacific. And the problem for any leader is somehow to retain political control over a country that size, and with so many different kinds of people living within that country, even though the framework is essentially Russian, and that was quite clear. But there are many different kinds of people who live there. It is a huge country. Any leader would probably have to have some degree of authoritarianism in his rule. The question, though, for me, because I did and try to do whenever I go back to Russia, many times over many years now, is to try to talk to young people. And there is two responses. One, which is quite wonderful, because I talk to them and I see the possibility of a bright future. They are smart people. They know what they're doing. And then what happens when they get older? They seem to fall into a rut. And maybe that has to do with the very nature of the country. I'm not sure. I don't know. And I've been struggling for an answer to that question. Because over decades now, starting in the 1950s, I have talked to Russian young people who are bright, smart, their eyes are sparkling, and they want things that I see up at the Kennedy School. It's the same thing to me. And yet, when they get into their 40s and 50s, they fall into a rut. And I don't understand it. I'm just raising it as an observation to be shot down or explained. But that is something I just wanted to share.
Can I just add that the Russian winter also to these sort of conditions is not only very, big, but it's very cold for a lot of the year. And a lot of the land is just uninhabitable. It's very difficult to rule. Andrew, did you want to jump in?
No, I mean, I think the only thing that I would put on there, which is one of the themes in Richard Pipe's book, Russia Under the Old Regime, is that precisely as Greg said, because the land is so unforgiving and conditions are so tough, it bred a certain innate conservatism, particularly in rural Russia. And that the person who came to the village and said, hey, I have a great idea, let's change our crop rotation and that'll pump up yields or we'll do something new, that would have endangered the entire village in many cases. And so that level of kind of innovation or risk-taking, at least in the peasant communities in historic times, was frankly often discouraged because it was seen as putting everybody at risk. And so, today we look forward to, imagining a Russia which isn't run in this, semi-authoritarian fashion, but there is an innate risk aversion that the Russian people who've been through such turmoil in the last 100 years are likely to respond to. And they look at the alternatives to Putin, or the lack of alternatives to Putin, and they can imagine if there were somebody else that might be really disruptive for them and for their personal safety or their family's well-being. And so it's understandable that people kind of go with what is on offer and don't necessarily imagine there could be something different. We in the West make, I think, a set of assumptions about what motivates people in other societies. And I don't think we always listen to those voices of kind of caution and people's willingness to kind of put up with a lot. That social contract worked up to a point for Putin in the sense that he delivered ever-increasing levels of socioeconomic prosperity through much of his rule. But that kind of came to an abrupt end probably around the time of the global financial crisis in 2008, or it hit Russia more in 2009. And after that, the main sort of source of legitimacy and mobilization for his political support has been this idea that Russia is back on the global stage. And we see that in the war in Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, and now what we've had in Syria and in the interference in the United States election. And I think that kind of anti-Westernism, the sense that Russia is a besieged fortress, that Russia is surrounded by all these enemies, and only by unifying the people and rallying around Vladimir Putin and around the regime itself, that sort of provides this sense of mobilization and support for the regime, which I think they can milk and continue to drive forward into the future.
But for how long? I mean, how sustainable is it? Because as you say, the conventional wisdom was that the Putin social contract was providing rising living standards, as you say, and when certain food imports from the EU were banned in retaliation for Western sanctions over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people thought, he's done it. He's crossed that line. He's now meddling in people's personal lives, and but his popularity, his popularity only grew. And my theory is that Putin was not only talking the talk about restoring Russia to its historical greatness, maybe not Soviet superpower status, but certainly using the symbolism. But now he was walking the walk, triggering this sort of latent association in the Russian people between deprivation and superpower status of your country. I mean, do you think that's something that's that's sustainable?
That's the $64,000 question, and people, I think, constantly debate it in this town, both in policy and analytical circles. On the one hand, there's no doubt that this is a very centralized country that's had great wealth and has really had a dramatic surge in living standards. So the Russians today live better than probably any Russians in 1,000 years, and that's not lost on average people. On the other hand, there's something very rickety about the system, and it has, when it's, when you see whatever pressurized event, there are times when you feel like, wow, this thing really is a bit more of a house of cards. The appeals to Russian greatness clearly resonate, and you've seen this in the wake of the war in Ukraine, that people look at what happened in Ukraine as especially the seizure of Crimea, as something that is a great historical consequence. They tend to not pay attention to the fact that they have now lost Ukraine as a country that up to now had been quite friendly toward Russia for generations to come. Too much blood has been shed for it to be any other way. And they've in many ways solidified a kind of Ukrainian identity which will be anti-Russian and will view Russia as an aggressor for generations. That to me looks like a strategic calamity. It does not look like a victory for Vladimir Putin. Likewise, in the United States, Russia's very blatant interference in the election here, I think, has now soured a generation of American policymakers, a generation of American politicians who will now look at Russia as this kind of menacing force. And some of that may be overblown. Some of it may kind of make Russia seem like it's 10 feet tall when we have other more major challenges either at home or internationally. But that's now just a fact of life. The place where I guess I'm most concerned is that we, by buying into some sort of grandiose images of Russia as a neo-Stalinist country or Putin as the inheritor of Stalin and all that, we tend to kind of miss some of the changes under the surface. And there's no doubt that there is a generation of Russians, I would argue, who really still want to be a normal country, and sort of somewhat disagree with Marvin about this, and who've built businesses and who've built lives that are more global and more sort of internationally flavored than any of their predecessors might have enjoyed. And they want to see Russia not be treated as the international villain, and they want their voice on the international stage to be heard. They want their country's, what they believe, legitimate interests to be promoted. That's incredibly hard sell these days, given that Russia is increasingly viewed as an international pariah. But in many ways, the Russians we work with at Carnegie, we have an office in Moscow, it's staffed entirely by Russians. Part of our mission is to allow those people to have that voice on the international scene, and we're trying very hard to listen to them and not just kind of assume that everyone in Russia speaks with a unified set of talking points and has to be a spokesman for the regime. And I think in many ways, the cutbacks in how we listen to Russia are visible. There's not a lot of day-to-day news coverage of Russia. When it is covered, it tends to be to fit that sort of standard portrayal that Russia is the international bad guy.
Now, Nina, can I ask you, in your travels this summer, what was your sense of how the Russian people react to this official version of history? And I ask because it seems that Russia is a difficult place to actually take an accurate measure of public opinion. It's a place where people tend to say what they think they're expected to say. Taking voting, exit polling, for example, people tend to reply that they voted for the person that they think was going to win rather than the person that they supported. And it's also a place where there's the official version of history, but even within it, there are all sorts of margins that undermine the official narrative. Just this week, Putin unveiled the first official monument to the victims of political repression in Moscow. I mean, it's incredible that it's taken so long. Some people said it was an important step. Others say that it doesn't really substitute for a real counting of the Soviet crimes against humanity. But does these margins sink in? Does this and here you were traveling and we have Lenin's statues, these monuments across the country, many of them very uniform, to a regime that in recent memory crumbled.
Well, I think it is complex. I was actually struck by how homogeneous Russia is, because I was going to see this incredibly diverse country with a variety of opinions. And I did see some of it. I didn't see as much of it as I thought. It was remarkable to see that Crimea essentially is across the board with young and old. Of course, there were people who do not say that Krym nash, which is Crimea is ours, but most of the time, Kaliningrad, the westernist enclave in Russia, and they live in Kant. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, everything is about Kant. Kant is their Lenin. They moved Lenin from the main square, they put the double eagle, and everything is about Kant. The university, the museum, the books, the little mugs, everything. And I said, so how does it feel to live in to live in a culture that essentially not yours. It's not your culture. To which a young woman replied to me, well, what can we do? Crimea is ours. And what she meant was, whatever we take, we keep. And that was stunning. She was a young, successful businesswoman who is traveling abroad and went to Kaliningrad to successfully do some fashion designs. You get to Vladivostok, and in Vladivostok, on the side of the highway, you have a picture painted of the Crimean Peninsula, and the kind of with the caption saying, Crimea is Russian and the island is Russian and Crimea is of Russian origins, sort of Крым, Остров Русский, Крым Российский. So it does cut across, and when you talk to people who are otherwise young, wonderful, amazing entrepreneurs, and I think that goes a little bit to what Andrew was saying, is that Russia could be as Western as they come. In fact, I actually think that Russia is a Western country that is just terrified of competing on normal terms and therefore says, well, we are the un-West. We're not going to be that. But because it's all formulas of existence, Western, in so many ways. But what is, I find absolutely remarkable is that, what was I responding to you about? God. Something I'm responding to you. Oh, it's the sort of the idea. No, the idea is that the state comes first, and the young people who write for you and do work for you think that they don't think that way. But what I've discovered, that the more you dig, the more they still think that it's better to be part of a great country that a country that is small and insignificant. And I always find it shocking, because I think Russia's problem is not necessarily that it's so big, because you can do an honest federal country, so you don't have to be in control of governors and mayors of little places. You can actually make it work. But what you don't make work is that this idea of the Russian greatness, and that's what I saw, that young and old and everybody, they would want to, for them being a Russian means more than just, well, no wonder the United States and the Soviet Union were two superpowers competing for the world domination, because in America it also means more to be an American than, I don't know, I mean, every country is very proud of itself, but in Norway you rarely hear that kind of grandiose point of view about oneself. But in Russia you do, and I think that actually keeps its development, because it keeps harking back to its traditionalism, because the memory of it is that grand, the country that people were afraid, they were respecting, and whatnot. So I don't know if the young people would ultimately push it through, because it is possible that they would start. But just one little thing. One thing that I noticed when I was growing up, everybody wanted to go abroad. Now, people in Yekaterinburg don't want to go abroad. They just want to have normal life and build Russian life. And that may be something that the future, if Putin lets them and goes away one day, what future will happen.
Can they afford to go abroad anymore? Can they afford to go abroad?
Well, but I mean, maybe. Yes, they're not, because another thing that people think that, sanctions came in and Russia started suddenly starving. No, there's no such thing. There's no starvation. Yes, there is no more brie made in France, but there is brie made in Perm. Yes, it's not as great, and it's the same price, and that's actually how the government makes its money. It's the same price, but it is brie, and therefore, ultimately, there is no such thing as starvation. So those sanctions that we think were so detrimental in terms of food products actually were not, because you have those products.
Can I just tag on to that with just two basic facts that people, I think, should remember when they think about Russia? One is that the sanctions that Russia imposed on itself, the average Russian, thanks to the state's control of the media, especially television, they believe those are Western sanctions on Russia. They believe that it's the West that decided not to sell brie, as opposed to something that Russia has done to itself. And then second is that when the media or any of these tools that we've now started to see in our own society are evaluated, it really does shape people's perceptions at pretty much all levels of Russian society. There's only about 14% of Russians which have passports that allow them to travel abroad. And so the people that we've gotten used to seeing in Europe or sort of in global sort of middle-class travel destinations, that is still just a very small fraction of the Russian people. And the bulk.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Because I was stunned by how many people actually went abroad and tell me, well, I went here and there and I wasn't impressed, which of course was a way of defending oneself, but still interesting, because I was under the impression that they're seeing the world and they're still not seeing it.
So my last question, and to any of you, is that we talked a lot about continuity, about the constants, the geography, the climate, the idea that the group is the basic unit of survival, that individualism is a threat to the common survival, and yet when we talk about Russia these days, we almost often, very often use Putin. Putin does this, Putin does that. Putin is restoring Russian greatness because NATO was expanded when Russia was weak, and so on and so. So, can Russia escape? I mean, it's a very broad, sort of vague question. But can Russia survive? First of all, can Putin's system, is there a chance that that this highly personalized rule that he's built around this cult of personality, can his system survive Putin? And can the system survive Putinism? Can Russia escape its history, or is it locked for all these reasons in a never-ending historical cycle?
I would certainly say that we should not believe that Russia has to be in the future what it has been in the past. There's no reason to believe that. If you do, you feel that everybody is locked into a psychological and historical prison and there's no escape. I think that's a very defeatist and probably unrealistic sense. True, Putin at this particular point has an 84% popularity with the Russian people. If you were to go through and analyze what it is that the Russian people superficially are exposed to, what they get on television, radio, sure, Putin has that kind of high number. But if you went back only 5 or 6 years, there were tens of thousands of people on the streets attacking Putin, which we tend to forget. And I think that it would be, there's another way of looking at this man, and that is to entertain the possibility that he is a very weak leader. There is nobody around to look to follow him right now. I accept that. But it strikes me that when a leader establishes a national guard, which he did officially in 2016, which has as its goal 350,000 soldiers as part of this National Guard, who are all over the country, who are there to look after Putinism and to make sure that that is what everybody is going to accept and believe is the reality and the inescapable reality. That doesn't sound to me like a leader who has a great deal of strength. It sounds to me like a leader who is frightened of his people, of the Russian people. And if that analysis is correct, and I accept that it could be dead wrong and it's a minority point of view, but if there is validity to that, that means to me that the Russian people collectively do have the absolute capacity to move in a different direction, not immediately, and it's not going to happen tomorrow morning, even if Putin dies or whatever, but it is going to happen. You cannot look at Russian history since the revolution over the last 100 years and not appreciate the fact that the Russian people are now a literate people. They were the first in space. They can do an awful lot of things. They're an educated people. And if they travel and now feel that they are better than other people, well, they've been told they're worse for so many years, that they can talk about being better. I just have a feeling that there's a lot more going on there than we give the Russian people credit for.
Thank you, Marvin. Do either of you want to jump in?
Just want to say, you say it's a minority. Actually, it is a, as you know, very well established political formula is that weak states have weak liberties. So when the strong power tries to establish itself as strong through security apparatus, it does mean it's a very weak power. And that has been actually Russian power through history, because when it tries to democratize it, it's being swept away. So that is something that we should remember. But I think Russia's problem is that revolutions or people go to the streets, at least in previous years, and hopefully it will change, every 25 years. When the country finally wakes up and thinks that it needs freedom in 25 years, that actually the country doesn't deserve those freedoms. Because it was in 91 when it came out, and then it came at 20 years, sorry. It came out in 2011 to protest Putin's return to power. So I think that more effective protests, and they're happening, in fact, in Magadan, from all places, that is something that actually shakes up that political system. Whether their support for Navalny, Alexei Navalny, the protest leader, anti-corruption leader, is something that they want to change because they want democracy, or they want a leader who appears to them more charismatic, but the same kind of strong personality that Putin has. That's a question. However, I think these little protests, if they continue to exist, and political changes in local offices will be allowed to exist, and that also happens on local level. Actually, you would know that even better. I mean, there are elections, suddenly local elections that suddenly bring candidates that nobody even thought about before. I think that will change that system, and even in a large country that can function properly. But I don't know how fast we can get there.
Just one quick point, which is that political change in Russia in the post-World War II era has really come about as a result of activities, and even in previous periods, in the capital city, and that's really been, whether it was Petersburg or Moscow, where the action was. And the second sort of key driver has been splits within the elite. And you saw that in the rise of Gorbachev, you saw that in the rise of Yeltsin, and then as well in the Putin era. And we, at the moment, don't see a lot of those kinds of forces gathering. There's unhappiness, as Nina points out. A lot of those are cries for help, and sort of people are wanting to be paid off or sort of get the center's attention and get some sort of transfer of resources to kind of make, put a Band-Aid on whatever their grievance is. The final thing, which I think would be great in the discussion, if we can talk to a little bit, is that we should look in the mirror ourselves about, why has the West, mismanaged relations with Russia for extremely long periods? Why have we either had the wrong expectations? Why have we sought the outcomes that we thought were right for Russia, but didn't necessarily get traction inside Russia itself? And what is it about the leadership's paranoia about the West that we have helped aggravate? Because I think there's no doubt that Vladimir Putin believed that it's the US that's been responsible for things like the revolution in Ukraine, the Arab Spring, popular protests that Marvin refers to on the streets of Moscow, and that he needed to punch back really aggressively. And it was that desire to punch back that set in motion their involvement in our election.
But even when, I remember I was in Moscow in 2008 when, during the Russia-Georgia war, when Putin said, in my recollection, it was the first time that I heard him say that, but now it's almost a decade ago, that the US wants to topple the government and steal our natural resources. You think he honestly believes that?
I think at part that line is very, very politically convenient, and it sells well with average Russians, particularly low information, people who are dependent on TV to tell them how to think, and who are not and frankly are easy to persuade on stuff they don't really care that much about because it doesn't really affect daily socioeconomic conditions.
Well, thank you very much. I will now open up to questions. We have microphones there in the back. Oh, okay. And can you please introduce yourself before asking questions?
Sure. My name is Rachel Oswald. I'm a reporter here in Washington. Thank you for a wonderful panel. I have a question for Andrew, and then I have a question for the whole panel. For Andrew, what are the confirmation biases that the U.S. government, U.S. policymakers have had as we design policies toward Russia, and how has that led to unintended consequences for us? And then to the panel at large, what do you think Americans culturally misunderstand about the Russian people? I hear of this thing called the Russian soul, and I have an idea about what it means, but not really, actually. So I'm wondering if someone can explain it to me. Thank you.
Welcome to the club.
No, it's a great question about confirmation bias. I would pick out one particular moment in U.S. policy, which was in the George W. Bush era, where we saw some very major U.S. policy initiatives, the war in Iraq, the decision to abrogate the ABM treaty, the treaty which banned anti-ballistic missiles capabilities with narrow exceptions, and then what seemed to be a very last-minute push in 2008 to talk about bringing two post-Soviet successor countries, Georgia and Ukraine, into NATO. And I think it was that sort of triple whammy that people didn't really believe or fully internalize in high levels of the US government at the time might lead to sort of dramatic efforts by the Russians to push back and to basically say, you were able to do such things when Russia was weak, but we're no longer so weak. And so that set in motion the war that Greg was referring to in August 2008, in which basically the Russians were willing to go to war to keep Georgia out of NATO. We saw that in 2014, where Russia was willing to go to war again to deal with what they thought was the potential for the United States and its Western allies to bring Ukraine squarely into the West. So we're now dealing with a Russia which not only is willing to veto or block policy initiatives that it strongly disagrees with, it's willing to use what it sees as its asymmetrical tools, cyber operations, information operations, and other activities to basically put countries like the United States off balance. And so I think that dynamic is now fully engaged. I don't expect us to get out of this cycle, and in many ways, we're headed for a world where the United States and Russia are going to be largely in a state of adversity. How dangerous that gets is not clear. In certain cases, we've been pretty good at managing that. I'd point out Syria as an example where we're both operating militarily at fairly close proximity to each other, and there's a real danger that you could have something get out of hand. But the stage is really set right now for a relationship, which, as one of my colleagues in Russia said, is going to get worse before it gets worse. And I think that's the reality. And the question for the Trump administration is, can they manage that successfully, as opposed to what Trump said as a candidate and at the beginning of his presidency, which is, we're going to get off on the great foot with these guys and we're going to do great things together. That's really unrealistic.
And then what is the Russian soul?
Well, I'm a Russian,
sorry.
I don't know what it is. Long story, but Russia is an Orthodox Christianity, and so just in a simple way, as you know, Orthodox Christianity believes in Holy Trinity, and the soul, actually the spirit, is the most important part of the Trinity versus other branches of Christianity. And so the Russians took it over from the Greek Orthodoxy, from the Byzantine Empire, and they just was carrying the torch of that soul until people talk about it, but very few actually believe in it. And what Andrew was saying was indeed excellent, because Putin not necessarily believing in all these asymmetrical insults that he has, but not necessarily afraid of NATO, for example, but he's, as a soulless man, using this opportunity to push forward his policy agenda. But generally, I think Dostoevsky, basically. If you want soul, just read that and weep of how horrible humanity is, with or without soul.
Hi, Luke Lorenz, the Alliance for Practical Policy Solutions. I'm curious, in terms of foreign policy, do you believe that Vladimir Putin truly has a long-term strategy for where he wants Russia to be 30 or 40 years from now, or has he acted perhaps out of self-preservation, strengthening his regime and rallying his base, and in that sense, has he put Russia on what might be an unsustainable trajectory as far as foreign policy after he leaves office?
My sense is that he is the owner of a very defensive foreign policy. I don't mean that he doesn't have ambitions at all. And I don't mean that he may be carried away one day in search of one of those ambitions. But I do feel that characteristic of Russian history, there is a constant balance between a leader thinking that the world is against us, we're encircled, we're about to be attacked. That has been going on quite literally for hundreds of years. And the amazing thing is, as Russia continues to talk about how they're encircled and about to be taken advantage of and attacked in one way or another, they keep expanding. And Russia is a huge place, and it's not a matter of needing additional land. So it isn't that. You can't have what kind of foreign policy would the Russians want now? If you could have all of the empire back in Eastern Europe, what does that do for you? In other words, at a certain point, you are either in a dream world or you have to deal with reality. And I think that Putin is quite aware of what the reality is. He tends, I think, to frighten people, and people tend to be frightened. We were talking earlier about our national obsession right now with Trump. And there is in Russia a national obsession with Putin. And it might be the most wonderful thing in the world if Trump and Putin went to the North Pole and let their countries try to take care of one another. Joke.
Can I just say very quickly that, first of all, in answer to both questions, that there is no such thing as a Russian soul. Russians are human, just like everybody else. And the reason that I think that so often a Russian soul is assigned to Russians is that we don't quite understand the practical system that works. And one of the reasons that Putin is so successful at remaining in power for so many years is that he runs a system that's not very efficient, that's incredibly corrupt, that's weak. I mean, all of the things that we've been saying, but it works for him. It works for keeping him in power. And I think one of the things that we as Westerners tend not to give full credit for, perhaps, is the importance of corruption in Putin's system. For us, corruption is an unfortunate byproduct of bad governance, perhaps. But in Russia, it is the system. It is the way that Putin exerts control from the top down. Corruption enables him to coerce people because everybody's complicit in a corrupt system. Everybody has to pay bribes on the street, or if you're a shop owner, or whenever, people are constantly paying bribes, and so you're complicit. You can be arrested at any time, but it also co-opts you because you are a part of a going system. However inefficient it is in this tremendous territory where in the Far East they say the God is high and Moscow is far. That's what's tended to work.
My name is Larry Jarvik, and taking up on your Trump, filmmaker. I made a film with Augustine Blasquez, The Trump Effect, and the Deprogramming of the American Mind, which deals a little with this. The question I have is the unpredictable past history of Putin's Russia. President Trump recently released the JFK files, which I've looked at, not all of it on the internet. Some are being held back. There are many references to Russia, the Communist Party, and so forth. I'm wondering, do any of the panelists think that President Putin will follow President Trump's lead and release the Russian documents on what they did related to the Kennedy assassination? Thank you.
No.
They actually try to hide more documents, not release them.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Colin Lawrence with the Forum on International Affairs. I've been taking a couple of notes trying to keep up with all your guys' insights, and it's been quite excellent. And so what I want to kind of look at and highlight some of the things that you mentioned. You had mentioned some of your impressions about Russian youth as it comes to kind of their traveling abroad and impressions of places outside their country. So I was wondering if you as a panel could kind of talk, especially for young professionals in the room and people that are trying to learn a bit more about Russia, its history, its culture, its people, about what this kind of upcoming, what did you say? Things are going to get worse before they get worse. With that kind of in mind, how is that going to impact kind of track 2 diplomatic efforts for educational exchanges between universities? Because we see in China, there's a bit of a dampening down on the higher educational systems about what people can talk about and explore in the kind of back and forth between countries. Do you see a similar impact in Russia today? And maybe what are your projections for the future? Thank you.
I don't work with universities there, not anymore. I used to, but not anymore. What I was really struck about is that as young people display very strong Russianness on one hand, on the other hand, they're monumentally curious about anything. I mean, about everything. And also with a sense of humor. So what was really interesting that, I mean, I don't experience any animosity as a Russian in the United States, but I've lived here for almost 30 years. Maybe if I do experience, I don't even notice it anymore. I mean, now with the new round of sort of the Russian, slightly anti-Russian, slightly hysterical attitudes. But there is really absolutely nothing like that. So that idea, which was almost traditional, is that the state does what it does, but we live our own lives, and that exists. So that is a possibility, but there's still there now certain history classes that are no longer the Yeltsin type classes when you actually look at history, but now you look at history. There's a lot of orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy that's being taught, other kind of anti-Catholic views and whatnot. So this, I think that creates a certain kind of worldview. But there is excellent education. I mean, the Soviet Union, Russia has excellent education. And so I wouldn't worry that much about diplomacy per se, because they would get their education and figure it out. But my nephew actually is a student at the Moscow GIMOI, the Moscow Institute of Foreign Relations, and he says that his group is divided into some are the very, very patriotic and pro Lavrov kind of group, and then there are those who just look at it with a great critical eye. But I think it always has been the case. There's always somebody who think that Russian experience should be, so that would dictate the rules of the world, and those who actually would like to fit into world affairs. About 5 years ago, they were incredible across Russia, kind of democracy building exercises and institutes. They are dying down. Putin has closed them down, and I think that is a very, very sad reality. But I would just go with Marvin. I don't think that kind of burying it and thinking that it's all about Putin. I mean, even if he stays for another 6 years, he's going to be an old man. He's going to be dead, taken out, or something would happen. And there would be a new cycle, even if we would have to wait for it a little longer.
Then think about an argument that appears to be brewing about whether you remove Lenin from his tomb. Why in God's name should that be an argument? But it is. And you still have that split in Russia. But I remember in '56, when there was the beginning of American artists coming to Moscow. The Russian people knew about it even before it was announced. And the Arbat was filled with people trying to get tickets to listen to Leonard Bernstein's fabulous performance, and he brought the house down. Jan Pierce singing, Isaac Stern playing. I still remember when he finished his concert, they would not let him leave the stage. I mean, the place was in an uproar. And it spread out into the street, and it went on for hours. And that is there. And it could be that there's a lot of, and I think Nina has just touched on this thing, that there are areas where Putin is definitely trying to keep it under very tight control, but it's there. And how long he exists, who knows? But I'm sorry, to think in excessively negative terms about that, I think is to miss the underlying reality.
But the sad thing about it is that it was in '56, and we're going through this again in
Absolutely,
2017.
absolutely.
I mean, that is the
It just-
tragedy. is that we
absolutely.
still have to think the underlying when it should be an open country with all the amenities that democracy can offer.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
There's two more questions.
Hello, my name is Wei Wang, and I'm a Chinese citizen living in the United States for 20 years. I have some friends living in Moscow and in other cities who working for the Chinese cultural exchange program. I'm very happy to see Mr. Xi and our president and Mr. Putin have such a great chemistry, and the cooperation between our two countries have never been better. I just want to say Russia's future is in Asia. I'm very happy to see that. And also, I want to say that China is going to finance and partially finance the railroad, the high-speed trains connecting Kazan and Moscow. And why in this country there's no high-speed trains? I mean, it's time to stop lecturing Russia and other countries about democracy, freedom. It's time for the rest of the world to learn from Chinese. We Chinese. I just want to say that. And I also want to say.
I'm sorry. If you have a question, please.
Yeah, my question is, my question to Nina Khrushcheva, what role did China play in suppressing the 1956 revolt? I read a book which I saw the Mao did a great effort to persuade Khrushchev to send the army into Hungary.
I actually, please forgive me, I don't know about Mao doing that. I do know that Mao was very upset about the anti-Stalin secret speech.
Yes.
He was very traumatized by that. That I do know. And I think the Russian, I'm sure the Hungarian uprising was not appreciated by any communist country. And of course, China was a very powerful one. So I'm certain that there were discussions about that. But more than anything, there was Andropov, who was for later KGB, and then the general secretary of the Communist Party later on. He was the one who was probably pushing Khrushchev more than anybody, because his argument that the communists are being hung on trees in Hungary, and that was, of course, for any communist leader would be a disaster. And so I think that pushing from inside was probably as strong as there was a push from China, although I don't know the push from China in greater detail.
So my name is Chase. So Putin, obviously, in his role as the president of Russia, very much a patriarchal figure, sort of the face of a unified Russia, taking it into to a new future. My question is, being such a large country, how do some of the smaller minority groups, the different ethnicities and races within the Russian country, how do they see themselves as part of this new Russian future? It seems like when we see pictures of Russians, whether it be in pop culture or even in the military, it seems to be very European ethnocentric and not so much sort of the Southern Russian or more of the Eastern Russian faces that we see. And I'm just curious how they see themselves within the Russian future going forward.
Anyone want to take a stab?
Well, I
Yeah.
can. I mean, I was in Dagestan this summer. I was in Yakutia and in Buryatia. So there's a ethnic minorities, as they're called. They're all different. I mean, they all see themselves differently. In Dagestan, they're grateful to Putin for, as they say, protecting them from the Georgian invasion, as they keep talking about it, that Georgia would take them over. So they're grateful to Putin. They are not really part of the Russian identity anymore. This is sort of separate countries, although they are countries within Russia. It's very, Chechnya is like that. They're creating their own states that, under the right circumstances, probably they would like to be separate as well. So this is actually very dangerous dynamic, because this is also places where a lot of radical Islamists can come from and be created. So they try to be Russianized, but now it's easier, what I understand from the policies, it's easier to keep them that way and let their own leaders to deal with that while they're there. With Yakutia is interesting because it's a very large part of Siberia called Sakha Republic. They're larger than Australia in size, and they're very proud of it. And they keep wanting to separate, but they haven't figured out what to do if they separate. They do produce an extreme amount of gold. They have incredible natural resources. And so one of the Putin's know-how, which was an interesting one, because the Soviet Union was essentially Russify them and rob them of all their riches, and killed also a lot of them because Stalin loved those things when he would move people from villages to other villages, so they wouldn't really create those kind of places where they would share identities. So what Putin has done, interestingly, actually Yeltsin began that and Putin continued. The state takes a lot of their riches, but it also gives them some. And so they've created their own identity now. They're pushing it through, and they're much more comfortable being within Russia with that. They don't have to take care of their own statehood. In Buryatia, essentially, they all want to go to Mongolia. I mean, that's kind of an interesting comment on China, because they really want to get to Mongolia and unite with Genghis Khan. So, I mean, and that what really presents the variety of the country, and that makes the country interesting. There are other places, it's just the three that comes to mind right away. But what was really interesting about Russia generally, with all these complexities, is that it is a universe. I mean, it can exist in an enclosed universe, and I think that what makes it so difficult to analyze, but also for it to so difficult to join the world as one country, not just people, not just parts, but as one country.
Thank you.
Can I just say very quickly that the one thing that Moscow or in St. Petersburg was successful at throughout most of Russian history was essentially co-opting local elites. The local elite groups would come in, and they would have to come into Moscow or to Petersburg and be part of the court. And now Putin appears to be doing the opposite. I think that's new in Russian history. It's the opposite dynamic. Thank you, and thank you to our panelists. Please give everybody a big round of applause. Thank you.